Hello artists and welcome to day 41. Today we are talking about 4-point perspective and how your camera lens affects the photographs you take that you intend to use as source material.
So you can do what you wanna do. You already know. You can do what you wanna do.
So before I get into camera angles and how to take photographs to best portray your subject matter, I just want to address 4-point perspective. Now, we discussed 1, 2 and 3-point perspective in part of the fundamentals of art, and I specifically didn't discuss 4-point perspective at the same time. The reason being 4-point perspective can be both a good thing and a bad thing, and today we're going to discuss positives and negatives related to 4-point perspective. But before I do that, like I said, I need to actually describe to you what it is. Now, 4-point perspective is effectively when you've got a long, tall object and your line of sight is in the middle, so your angle of vision is quite wide. So what will happen here in the middle, when it's horizontal to your line of vision, that distance there is shorter than that distance there. So the middle of your subject is closer to your eye than the top and the bottom of the subject. So effectively you'll be looking up at the top of your subject and down at the bottom of your subject. And what that does is it gives you a distorted view of your subject, where the middle of the subject, lying here on your horizon line, actually appears bigger in your field of vision than the top and the bottom do. Now, this happens in life as well with our normal vision, but we don't necessarily notice it as much because number one, we've got binocular vision, and number two, our eyes are constantly moving around our subject that we're looking at in real life. So our eyes compensate for what we're looking at. However, in a drawing or in a photograph, it becomes much more obvious because it's a static image. So I want to address the positives first of 4-point perspective. Now, 4-point perspective is used a lot by particularly fantasy artists and concept artists. It can be used to create amazing effects, specifically reflections on a sphere-shaped shiny object. And artists can give their paintings a fish-eye lens type of effect by sticking to 4-point perspective. So it can be great fun to work with. It can be a negative if you're unaware of how it affects your work. So let's go through what it actually does and how it will affect your work. So what I have here on the screen in front of me is 3 photographs taken of the same lady standing in the same position without moving a muscle. Now, I know this for a fact because I took these photographs today, and the person depicted in the photograph is actually my eldest daughter. I asked her to stand absolutely still and to keep her eyes fixed on the same spot, and I moved around her. To be more specific, I moved further away from her. Now, the first photograph, if I'm not mistaken, I was approximately 3 to 4 meters away from her. I was using a Nikon SLR camera, and I was making sure that I was lined up. My eye level was roughly in the middle of her body. Now, what you can see in this photograph is that I'm looking up at the bottom of her chin, and I'm looking down at the top of her feet. And the center of her body here appears to be larger in the frame, although she's quite a slim girl, so it's not necessarily terribly obvious with her, but you can certainly see it on the skyline behind her. We're seeing more sky in this photograph than what we're seeing in these photographs, and I was at the same level and so was she. The only difference between these two is that I was further away for each one. In the second photograph, I was about 7 or 8 odd meters away from her. I had the camera at the same angle, and as you can see, I'm getting a better field of vision here. Her face is a little bit more face on. In fact, it's a lot more face on, and her feet are not quite so oblique, and the difference between the shoulders and her hips are not quite as distinct as what it is in the first one. And the last one here was probably about 10 to 12 meters away from her. And now it's even better. Now the face looks even more face on. In fact, in the photograph, if you didn't know that she was standing without moving a muscle, one would assume that she had dropped her head, particularly in this photograph. But I can assure you that is not the case. This is simply a lens distortion effect that we're getting here. Now, we'll explain to you in a minute how that happens. So as you can see now, I'm a little bit more eye level with her chin, it appears. There's even less distortion going on here in the middle of her body, and the feet, although I'm still looking at the top of the feet, which you always will, the feet appear to be more level with the ground. So let's go ahead and describe to you exactly what was going on here when I was taking these photographs. So in the first photograph, I was relatively close to her, and the angle that the lens was giving was approximately 50 degrees. So as you can see, what's happening here is the top of the camera's field of vision had to rise quite steeply to reach the top of her head, and the bottom had to drop quite steeply to reach her feet. So the field of vision, as you can see, is coming up underneath her chin and down onto the top of her feet. And if one measured the distance from the middle of her body to the camera lens and from the top of her head to the camera lens, you'll notice that the line of sight along the top line is quite a lot longer than the line of sight across the middle. Now what that does in the camera's lens is, because light has to travel further along the top than it does in the middle and along the bottom than it does in the middle, the camera is going to put that into a flat plane of the photograph, and therefore it appears distorted. Now let's have a look at the first and second photographs together and how the distance that I was away from the model actually affected it. Now, as you can see in the second one, like I said, I was slightly further away, not quite double the distance away from her. The angle of sight from the camera to the model has now reduced to 27 degrees. So the angle that the camera is having to take to cover the whole model is less. So consequently, the distance that light has to travel to the camera lens from the middle of her body to the head of her body has proportionately reduced. So although the difference between that and that distance there, the difference in distance, in other words, from the front of her body to the top of her head, has not changed, the relative difference between that area there and this whole area here has changed. This is now a lot less, relatively speaking, than it was in the first photograph. Consequently, a simple geometric effect has happened here. As the camera has moved further away, so the line of vision is closed a little bit. And this has helped to reduce the distortion in the model. It is actually so significant that, as you can see, the trees behind her appear to be a lot closer and a lot bigger behind her on the second photograph than they do on the first photograph. Even the area of grass seems to cut through her at a slightly different place. It seems to be slightly lower on the second picture than it is on the first picture. That is simply the position of the camera away from the model. Now we'll take a look at the second and third photographs together, and you'll see we have exactly the same thing happening. The reduction angle is not quite as dramatic. It seems to reduce quickly when you're really close to the model and slightly less as you're further away. But again, we're getting the same thing happening. So the upshot of the whole thing is that the third photograph has far less distortion going on. My advice then to you, when you're taking photographs of models or of any subject in fact, is to rather step further back from your model and use your zoom lens to zoom in closer if you need to get in closer, rather than walk up to your model to take a photograph. This also works in real life, like I said. So if you're drawing from a life model, you're going to have exactly the same distortion happening in your drawing when you're using sighting. You're going to sight your model at your eye level a lot wider and a lot more distorted than you will at ground or upper level. And this I can tell you from experience, from having been in a life model class and not being able to understand why the legs and feet of my model appeared to be shorter and flatter than they were in real life, until it dawned on me that I was slightly taller than the model. I was sort of looking down on her. I was therefore seeing her in bigger perspective. When I sat down rather to sight her, I was able to get better results. This is a great example that I want to show you here. I found this on the internet today when I was doing my research, and this is actually a guy that blogs on photography, and he's given us a really, really great example. It's photographs of himself that he's taken with the same camera at various different distances away. This is another photograph, also an OB photograph that I found on the internet today that displayed it very well. This is a photograph taken quite close up where we can see the lower half of this person's face is quite pronounced compared to the top half. We can almost see the perspective happening in this man's head as his face narrows as it goes up higher because of the distortion of the camera lens. Now, one thing I did learn today when I was doing my research is that it is commonly understood amongst photographers that it is a wide-angle lens that causes this distortion. But in fact, it is not a wide-angle lens. It is simply geometry, because the same thing happens with a lens that is not a wide-angle lens. It just happens to a lesser degree, because it is the angle of distortion created by the distance away from your subject that you're standing when you take the photograph that actually causes this phenomenon to happen. Alright, so what I've done here is I've superimposed this photograph, the first photograph that I took of Ronwin, onto our little sketch of our 4-point perspective. And you can actually see a lot better how this has affected this photograph of Ronwin. The 4-point perspective is much more pronounced because, like I said before, you're looking up at underneath of her chin and down onto the top of her feet. So artists, the aim of this little tutorial is to help you to understand that your photographs that you're taking might well be distorted and might well include distortion that you're not looking for. If, however, you are looking for it, be aware of it and use it wisely. It can be an asset. Artists, as usual, can I ask you please to like and share and subscribe and share it around the internet, and I will see you tomorrow in day 42. Bye.
That's what you want to do.